Welcome to our panel that will take us to the future. We will discuss today trends and foresights in the Middle East, North Africa in 2030. I'm very happy to have with me 4 distinguished panelists that will take us to the different corners and issues of the region when it comes to the future. Paolo Magri, who's the Vice President of ISPI, Andrei Kortunov, the Director of the Russian International Affairs Council, Elham Fakhro, who's the Senior Analyst of the covering the Gulf States at the Crisis Group, and Tarek Youssef, the Director of Brookings Doha. My name is Florence Gaub. I'm the Deputy Director of the EU ISS and also a keen foresighter. But today my role is to manage these 4 foresighters and their vision of what's going to happen next. Now, COVID has, of course, tapped into a region that was already facing a challenging present and future. And some of the trends that relate to the future obviously have been accelerated, some have been slowed down. But COVID being a disruptive event, it has also created certain new circumstances, most famously, for instance, the truly historical drop of the oil price in early 2020. So we'll discuss a few of these issues, trying to look ahead, but we will not, of course, predict the future, just raise a few issues that relate to it. And I picked up an Arabic quote that I hope is correct. For every glance behind us, we have to look twice to the future. So let's just do that because we know already what's in the past. Can I please start with Dr. Paolo Magri? You work a lot on Libya, and of course, I want to congratulate you for the latest report that ISPI has just published after the storm, post-pandemic trends in the southern Mediterranean. So for the audience, if you're interested, you can pick it up from the ISPI website. But turning to you, Paolo, now about the Libyan conflict, how has COVID impacted an already very difficult situation? What do you think are the prospects for the evolution of this conflict, starting out from today and looking a bit further into the future?
Thank you, Florence. Let me just say one word first. I mean, we all listen to the jingle, the music that starts the session, and you in the panel have listened to that music over the last few years in Rome. And when I hear that, I'm always moved because I remember the crowded corridor of the hotel in Rome, and we miss them a lot. I miss you as well, and we miss the crowded corridor, which would not allow any social distancing, of course. Now, I mentioned that trying to avoid your question, Florence, because looking at the future of Libya, it's a tough question. On Libya, it's hard, unfortunately, to guess what will happen in 6 months' time, let alone a full decade. I'll try to make 2 points. First point, let me start from the here and now, the global pandemic. If we think of how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted on Libya, then the answer is not much. The public health emergency might have exacerbated existing circumstances, but it has played little, if any, role in the development of the Libyan crisis. It was part of the political discourse around Libya, but it was not a determinant aspect. Second point, Libya, as we know, is a story of lost hopes. A few weeks ago, we were holding our breath watching the UN-led meeting that was taking place in Tunis. It was described as an historical moment, the beginning of a new political phase. The mantra was, there is no solution away from a unified Libya. What happened? No agreement was signed. Yes, new elections were scheduled for December 2021, but December 2021 is 12 months away, and anything can happen in this year. So the situation in the ground is currently a deadlock. So looking to 2030, what can we expect? As I said, it's hard to make forecasts, but you can at least identify what could be the possible game changers in the Libyan match. First, the return of the US on the Mediterranean Sea and the new involvement in Libya. Could renewed transatlantic cooperation lead to a newfound effort by the Biden administration? Could the US go as far as threaten military intervention? Highly unlikely, as Biden has always sent clear messages on Libya when he was vice president. And the message were, move out, let the Europeans sort out their problems. However, renewed American interest will certainly change the card dealt to each player. Second, the reorientation of US-Gulf relations. As the Biden administration comes in, it may take a harder stance on the involvement of Gulf countries in foreign conflict, such as Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Libya as well. Could the end of the US green light toward the United Arab Emirates foreshow a lower Gulf involvement in Libya, military and financially? In my opinion, this is more likely than the first one. And combined with low oil prices, it could lead to a power rebalancing within the country in favor of the GNA and away from Haftar. A final and last game changer could be a different approach by the European Union toward Turkey. For now, Europe has taken a tough stance toward Ankara, in particular on the East Med basin. But if the EU and Turkey ended up finding a broader agreement on the East Med issue, in particularly on the maritime borders and energy exploration, then, in that case, Turkey's support for the GNA could be seen under a different light. And possibly all or most European countries could come to favor Turkey's involvement if it bolstered the GNA and ultimately stability in the most unstable country. So what? All in all, if forced to make a prediction, as you are forcing me, Florence, game changer could rebalance the situation in the future in favor of Tripoli and GNA in the next few years. But as I said at the beginning, let's see what happens in the next few weeks or months. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo, and also thank you for reminding us that conflicts are in particular hard to project, where their evolution is hard to project because conflict research is actually not as advanced as many people think. We know that on average, civil war, for instance, lasts 10 years, but that average, for instance, in Syria has been already surpassed. And of course, the statistic is not the reality. So thank you for giving us these game changers that we can keep an eye on to perhaps get a better idea of where Libya will go next. You just mentioned the Eastern Med. Let me turn to Andrei Kortunov. So the Eastern Med too is becoming a bit of a hotbed, I'm going to say. How do you think the situation will evolve there with tensions already prevalent? Do you think it's going to detente, or do you think it might get hotter? What is your take on this, Andrei?
Well, thank you, Florence, for giving the floor, and thank you for allowing me not to talk about Russia, but to talk about other players, and specifically about the Turkish role in East Mediterranean. I think that, unfortunately, it's likely that things will get worse before they get any better. And definitely, it's not just about Libya. It's about the current balance of powers, or rather the balance of weaknesses in this very important region of the world. And speaking of Turkey, which might be regarded as a troublemaker, as a country which challenges the status quo in the region, I think that definitely it has always been, it is, and it will always be an important part of the region, but a very special play in the region, given its imperial legacy and given its size. It is second only to Egypt in terms of population, and it is definitely the largest economic player in East Mediterranean. So I think that when we're talking about the future, especially long-term future, like 10 years from now, I think definitely the challenge is to bring Turkey to the table without granting Turkey veto power. And that's not easy, given the current state of affairs. I think that definitely it will be quite a challenge for Ankara, but also for states in the region. In my opinion, what we see right now is a kind of signs of imperial overstretch. We see Turkey being involved in too many conflicts, from Nagorno-Karabakh in the north to Libya in the south, and of course Idlib in Syria, and Iraq as well. So a lot will depend on how Turkey is able to reconsider some of its priorities and maybe to realize the limitations that it has to face. In my opinion, the future of the Turkish engagement in the region depends on two factors. First of all, the domestic development in the country after Erdogan. And I tend to believe that the political pendulum in Turkey will go in the opposite direction. And this neo-Ottoman strategy is likely to lose popularity within the country. We have already seen that Erdogan lost elections in major urban areas in the country. I think that social development in Turkey within the next 10 years will probably move Turkey closer to European nations and will probably weaken some of the traditionalists, some of the imperial-minded parts of the Turkish population. And second, of course, I agree with Paolo, a lot depends on whether the European Union is able to modify its approach to Turkey and to offer Turkey a legitimate role in resolving conflicts in the East Mediterranean, but also beyond East Mediterranean, because definitely Turkey cannot limit its foreign policy priorities to this region only. I tend to be moderately optimistic about the country, and my optimism is rooted in the analysis of the social transformation of the country, but I tend to be rather pessimistic about short-term future. I think that this neo-imperial zeal will be with us for some time, and it will complicate any arrangements between Turkey and other players. And though, as a Russian, I have to confess that though right now we seem to have a honeymoon between Putin and Erdogan, but I would not bet on this honeymoon to last for too long. Thank you.
But that makes me wonder, actually, if Turkey is a whack-a-mole. So if Turkey's role in the Eastern Med is reduced, will it also be reduced in Libya, or on the contrary, will it strengthen it elsewhere? But I think that's probably a discussion perhaps for later. Let me turn to Ilham. The so-called Abraham Accords, some call them a peace deal, even though there is no peace and certainly no real deal, at least not with the Palestinians. But normalization between Bahrain, the UAE, and Israel is a fact. So what do you think is this? Perhaps we can also call it a honeymoon. Is it the basis for a long-term marriage? Do you see this establish something that will transform a straw fire, as we say in German?
Yeah, so I think it's important to first provide an overview of what the accords actually look like. These are three separate documents. The first is the Abraham Accords Declaration. It's just a 200-word kind of statement of purpose signed between the four states that are involved. The second agreement is between Bahrain and Israel. It's a declaration of peace, cooperation, diplomatic and friendly relations. That's 1 page long. And then the third agreement is the Treaty of Peace, diplomatic relations and normalization between the UAE and Israel. That's about 7 pages long. So I think there are a few things to note from the outset. These documents are only a handful of paragraphs or pages at most. They're fairly broad, and they make reference to friendly ties, diplomatic relations, and issues of trade and commerce. They're very brief when compared with the peace treaties that Israel signed with Egypt and Jordan, which were obviously much more complex, involved issues of land and borders. But despite their length, they've already been used to establish the kind of full, normal, peaceful diplomatic relations that go well beyond the kind of relations that either Jordan or Egypt have with Israel. So not a week goes by here in the Gulf without additional kinds of cooperation being announced, building on the accords. So things like trade delegations moving back and forth. There is a settler trade delegation in the UAE, banking agreements, agreements in higher education, a film festival in the case of the UAE. So the intent is really for this to be full active relations of the kind that no other Arab state has with Israel. I think it's significant that they are not framed as a kind of security or defense cooperation. The language used touches on ideas of tolerance and coexistence, and I think this tells us that it's part of a long-term cultural shift that goes beyond what the other Arab states have tried to do. Now, what does this mean for the equilibrium in the Middle East? So since the Arab Spring, there's been a growing convergence of interests between Saudi, the UAE, and Israel. Within the Gulf, there was very much a sense of having been abandoned by the Obama administration. There was the sense that the US could no longer be counted on as the guarantor of their core strategic interests. And this evolved as a result of two events. The kind of support that the US expressed for the Arab Spring, which created a sense that the US was actively supporting a change in status quo that threatened the authority of the Gulf powers. For Saudi Arabia, the real game changer was the signing of the JCPOA. It took place without real consultation of the Saudis, and they complained that it addressed issues that were important to the US and Israel, the nuclear question, but not Iran's regional role or its ballistic missile program, which was of equal, if not greater, concern to the Gulf states. And now the other regional power that was also aggrieved by this was, of course, Israel. And I think the signing of the JCPOA really marked the coming together of this new Gulf-Israel alliance on the basis of a shared threat perception of Iran and dislike of Obama's policies. And with Trump coming into office, that was the signal of further alignment between these powers. I mean, they're all effectively on the same page. And Trump did very little to criticize the behaviors of any of the three states, whether domestically or at the level of foreign policy, laying the groundwork for even closer relations, eventually growing into overt ties. Now, I think it's important to kind of point out how this is described. Pompeo and Netanyahu have both referred to the accords as intended to strengthen cooperation against Iran, so the security aspect. But the UAE has been careful not to portray it as such. It emphasizes that this is about tolerance and coexistence. And I mean, I'll come back to this later if there's time, but what does this mean for the Palestinians? The normalization agreements effectively mark a major break with the traditional status quo or way of thinking around Arab-Israeli normalization. For decades, the established wisdom and Arab position was that the Arab states would only normalize with Israel after the Palestinian question has been resolved along the lines outlined in the Arab Peace Initiative. So what this does is breaks with the Arab state consensus, and it does leave the Palestinians with few options. They can try to negotiate a two-state solution, which is increasingly an impossible scenario as a result of the facts on the ground. Returning to armed struggle is the other option, and the third is working towards a one-state solution with equal rights. And I think this has been a significant game changer for the Palestinians, but what would transform it even further and effectively seal their fate really is if Saudi Arabia normalizes. And I think that's a question of when and not if. So just going back to how these accords were framed. So the UAE emphasized that this is not a security agreement. It's denied the fact that this has defense elements. And I think this messaging is partly as a result of the UAE's own concerns. Their policy towards Iran is closer to one of de-escalation. So there's a bit of a contradiction there, because while they support maximum pressure on the one hand, they also are actively de-escalating with Iran by doing things like sending COVID aid. When the tanker attacks happened in 2019, they stopped short of blaming Iran for that, whereas Saudi and the US both did that. So I think that reflects their own understanding of how vulnerable they are to an attack from Iran. Now, there are several benefits to the UAE, I think. The first, most obviously, was the access to the F-35 systems, which granted a strategic boost. But I think for the UAE, it's also about moving away from its once exclusive security dependence on the US. So bearing in mind the concerns that the Gulf states have had about US reliability, the UAE has taken steps to broaden its horizons. It buys drones from China, certain types of armaments from Russia, which have both been used in Libya. So this is part of its efforts to build closer ties with major regional and global powers, so China and Russia on the one hand, but also Israel as a major regional power. And I think there's no doubt that the UAE is also going to benefit. If we look kind of 10 years down the line, I think the defense aspect of the relationship is almost certainly going to be enhanced beyond things like intelligence sharing that exist at the moment. So over the next 10 years, I think the big question with regard to normalization is the question of Saudi Arabia. I think to me, it's clear that MBS does want to normalize, and he sees it in being in the Saudi interest to do so, but currently he's constrained for a number of domestic reasons. One being the lack of support for this from King Salman, and the other being the possibility of some societal blowback. So I think over time, Saudi Arabia will get there, just not right now. It's not clear to me whether that'll happen under a Biden administration, but it may. On the UAE, I think they see this kind of deepening cooperation with Israel as in their interest regardless. So I think that's going to turn into further that's going to have clearer security and defense relevance in the future. And I think, again, another question is on Iran as well. If the Gulf states improve their relations with Iran, then again, I think that affects normalization to some extent. But for now, I think the alliance is here to stay.
Thank you. The region always makes me think of a Rubik's Cube. You know, when you turn one side, the other side turns automatically with it. So in this case, the Palestinians are indirectly linked to the relationship the Gulf states have with Iran and so forth. So that it makes foresight particularly difficult because there are so many cooks in the kitchen. But turning from the geopolitical level to the economic level, Tarek, before the pandemic, parts of the region were already well on their way to digitalization and parts less so. Today you're talking from Doha to us via Zoom, so perhaps that would not have happened 10 years ago. Actually, not perhaps, it would not have happened 10 years ago, or we would have done it on a very bad Skype connection. So everybody says that for Europe, at least, or for America, that the pandemic has been the big accelerator for digitalization. How does it look in the region, which started perhaps out under different conditions? Does it have a lot of catching up to do? Do you see the boost that we've seen in Europe? And where does this lead further to 2030?
Thank you, Florence, for posing a set of very interesting questions. And of course, thanks to ISPI for organizing this important panel where we're looking at the next 10 years. I am tempted to believe in the possibility, and I do recognize that in many parts of the world, COVID-19 has been an accelerant for digitization. But this digitization has to be taken in the context of many other things that are happening that are going to affect the next 10 years. Meaning the COVID-19 pandemic is not only a healthcare crisis, it's also a major economic crisis for many parts of the Middle East. I would actually argue that it's probably the biggest economic shock the region has faced in the post-independence era. It is not just about collapsing oil and gas prices, which have affected already very weak fiscal positions of many countries and given rise to very massive increases in debt. It is not only one that is affecting, exports and imports as we have normally seen in the past. It has unique characteristics that are going into the very structures of economies. Who works, where they work, the poor, the vulnerable, the informal, the small and medium-sized enterprises. I think this recognition of what the pandemic-led economic crisis is about should frame how we think about the next 10 years, including what role digitization can or cannot play in helping to recover and certainly helping to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. We're still in the middle of the crisis. In fact, in many parts of the region, we have seen not just a resurgence, but we've seen major setbacks across a lot of non-oil exporting countries in terms of fatalities and infections, etc. So going back to the question of digitization itself, I think by and large, pre-COVID-19, we saw an emerging divide in the region between, let's say, the rich countries, the countries that made early advances, commitments to digitization, to financial technology, to ICT, and they happen to be mostly countries in the Gulf. So the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain made early investments that have in fact come in very handy as the pandemic hit many of these countries. And so they've managed to roll out a lot of services, move a lot of services online, and they've in fact continued to make investments that will allow them to accelerate the digitization of many services in their economies. That's not the case in many other parts of the Middle East, especially in conflict-affected countries. They were neither ready, they had not made the initial investments, and in fact, what COVID-19 seems to have done is create this digital divide. A divide between people who have access to the technology, white-collar workers, professionals, and people who don't have access to the technology, low income, poor. And in fact, there are many segments of the population where access to technology may not matter for their livelihoods. They work in economic sectors that require the face-to-face engagement. Think of tourism, think of hospitality, think of the informal sectors. So the worry one has as we think about the next 10 years is that this digital divide is going to create further disparities in a region that is already suffering from a lot of disparities between rich and poor, between people who have access to technology, people who don't have access to technology, and also between people who will have access to the vaccine in 2021 and people who will not have access to the vaccine in 2021. As a result, my concern as we think about the unique nature of this crisis, its multiple effects, it's how it interacts with already existing distortions and vulnerabilities in many parts of the region. It is likely to further pull countries apart and distinguish the rich from the poor, the haves versus the have-nots, those with digital access, where you see digital acceleration, and countries that are going to be facing a lot of problems that they had made progress on in the past, needing to address safety nets, needing to contain the impact on poverty, the massive negative damage that has been done across many informal sectors in countries like Jordan, Tunisia, Lebanon, and now Morocco. I think it's this scenario, thinking about the next 10 years, that worries me the most. And I think looking back just at the last couple of recessions in this region and how the region recovered, recoveries tended to be very protracted, tended to be very hesitant, tended to be very incomplete. And this was only in context of oil and gas price declines. Now we're looking at a much more complex economic crisis. It's about the things I've named, but it's also about the impact on very high labor-intense sectors like tourism and hospitality and trade. It's going to affect a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises relative to the big corporations. It's going to also affect, unfortunately, the corporate and the banking sector. We already saw in the last couple of years a lot of strains on banks, a lot of big corporate failures. I think there is a much higher probability now of more of this to come. And worst of all, this all happens in the context of low oil prices moving forward and most countries having very little fiscal space. I worry, Florence, and I'll end here, that the next 10 years might be a period where, in fact, most countries in the region witness setbacks in socioeconomic development, witness setbacks in their standing vis-a-vis other countries, and end up spending the decade trying to reclaim lost ground, trying to rebuild social safety nets, trying to rebuild and contain the impact possibly on poverty. This is not to say that the next 10 years cannot also be and shouldn't be an opportunity to rebuild institutions, to incentivize public sectors, and to reform where necessary. But on balance, I worry that the next 10 years are going to be ones where many countries in the region will lose ground vis-a-vis their recent history in terms of gains and vis-a-vis many other parts of the world. And there are obviously political implications here, implications for stability, for security, for social cohesion, and for relations with the rest of the world.
Thank you, Tariq. It's certainly very sobering to listen to you, but I always wonder, is this perhaps also, COVID in some ways is a blessing in disguise? Is this perhaps also a wake-up call for certain leaders in the region that the old model is dead? It was already dead before COVID, the economic model, the political model. the social model in some ways, or not dead, but there need, as you just said, there need to be reforms, there need to be very painful changes made. And I think the Arab Spring, which I think would have been the first wake-up call, was not really heard, at least not in most places. So maybe COVID will be heard, but perhaps in the second round, when I come back to you, you have a few ideas on how this opportunity could be leveraged. But I agree with you, it's certainly not a very optimistic outlook, which brings me actually to a question on migration for Paolo. You touch on this in the report that ISPI published together with the Russian Institute for International, the RIAC. What do you see? So, by the way, on migration, Foresight is particularly bad, or not bad, but I read a statistic that said that 60% of predictions about Foresight are wrong. That's because it's a fundamentally human affair, and humans are particularly difficult to anticipate. Where do you think, or what is the outlook that you have on migration, particularly given the dire landscape that Tarek just painted?
Thank you. After what Tarek has just said on the economic consequences in the next few years, economic and social, probably not much should be added on migration in the next 10 years. The answer is already implicit in what he said. But let me try to see briefly what could happen between today and 2030 and try to answer to the question, will we be able to cope? As we show in the ISPI RIAC report published today, the global pandemic has had a number of effects on migration flows. And by the way, studying this unexpected shock is a great way to show how hard it is to predict what could happen over the next decade. However, let me try to put some figures, hoping they are correct in context. The predictions are correct in context. Let's start from a few things which are not hard to predict, such as the willingness of persons to migrate in the future or forces driving migration. And let me focus on two forces, economic and demographic drivers. On the economic side, every year, almost 3 million non-European citizens enter Europe, mostly to work. And these numbers are driven by one of the simplest facts in the world: how much you can earn if you move to another country compared to the one you are in. Just think about this. Last year, the difference in GDP per capita between the average European country and the average African country was 12 times. And this has actually increased over the past decade. On average, African made 10 times less than European in 2009, and now it's 12, sorry. What then can we say about the next decade? And let's go back to Tarek. Well, that the reason to migrate to another country to look for a better future will continue to be there, or maybe even grow due to the economic impact of the pandemic on low-income countries. And what about demographic drivers? We all know that the number of inhabitants in Africa will continue to boom. It doubled in the past 15 years. It will double again to 2.4 billion by 2050. And Florence, you know that these numbers are easy to predict, not the migrant. The bottom line is migration is here to stay, whether we like it or not, in our countries and in the country of origin, of course. And many people will continue to cross the Mediterranean, whether regularly by plane or irregularly in a risky way by boat. Is that all? In a way, yes. But let me end by focusing on what the global pandemic is teaching us. The first lesson is quite obvious. The second requires more attention. Let me start with the first lesson, the one which is quite obvious. The closure of borders and the grounding of ships and airplanes as government took containment measures brought regular migration down by a lot. preliminary estimates show that this year, 2020, regular migration to Europe could be down 60%. This means that close to 2 million people that would have probably arrived in the EU in 2020 could not make it. But the second lesson is that across some Mediterranean routes, irregular migration is actually up a lot. The disappearance of regular channels, coupled with the global economic recession, has put a lot of pressure on people living in countries that already before the pandemic had high level of unemployment and low wages. Tariq mentioned Tunisia, Morocco, and then mentioned Lebanon. This is why irregular migration to Italy has tripled this year, and it's up 30% in Spain. As I said before, the bottom line is that we can expect that migration across the Mediterranean will be there in the future. Since driver to migrate will continue to be there, it is up to us, government and citizen, to find and offer solutions to manage this challenge together in a better way, rather than be overwhelmed by self-generated crisis.
Which leads me to, unfortunately, another rather glum topic. Of course, Syria. We have almost 1 million Syrians living now in Germany. I remember back in 2012, a British high-ranking officer coming to my office and saying, "How long does he have?" And I said, "Who?" And he said, "Bashar al-Assad, he's about to go, right?" And I said, well, what I know from conflict research is that he probably has a decade. But not that notwithstanding, I turned out to be right, unfortunately, but it just shows that it's extremely difficult, as we said earlier about Libya, to project a conflict into the future. Let's try anyway. Syria's war is approaching, well, a 10-year anniversary. Where do you think we'll be in 2030? Will we see Syria reconstructed, united, or perhaps the opposite, after a lull, another uptake in violent combat? What do you think, Andre?
Well, Florence, since you mentioned your conversation with a British official, let me also mention my experience with high-ranking American diplomats that took place about 2012. We had a second-track meeting on Syria, and we were trying to figure out whether the United States and Russia can somehow agree on a political transition. And we were authorized to present an offer to Americans saying that if the United States does not push for an immediate change, and if the United States exercises its impact on the opposition, not to get too far, then Russia might try to convince Bashar Assad not to run in 2014 for re-election. And our American counterparts rejected this offer, saying, no, that's too long. We will get rid of Bashar Assad much earlier than 2014. Of course, these people are no longer working for the Department of State, but Bashar Assad is still there in Damascus. So let me say that it is very difficult to be optimistic about Syria. And I think that what we know for sure, at least what I think we know for sure, is that the situation in Syria, the status quo in Syria, is not sustainable for another 10 years. And many bad things can happen in Syria. If you take the military situation, of course, we might observe a new escalation in Idlib. The situation there is not resolved at all. We can see more tensions and more hostilities in the northeast of the country. And definitely with the Biden administration, it's not likely that the United States will get out of Syria in the immediate future. We can see potential implosion of the Amman agreement on southwest of Syria. We can probably observe a more radical, more aggressive posture of Iran, with the domestic changes that are taking place in Tehran these days. So there are many things that can get wrong and that might lead to another cycle of military hostilities. On top of that, we can see many things that can lead to a further deterioration of the economic situation in Syria. For example, we all watched how the Lebanese meltdown affected the national finance of Syria. We now watch how the CISA legislation in the United States affects the economic situation there and drives potential investments from the Gulf away from Syria. The economic situation continues to deteriorate. Iran is no longer in a position to assist Syria economically. And of course, the capacities of Russia to replace Iran are also quite limited. So economic situation is not likely to get any better. It's likely to continue deteriorating. And though one can argue that the regime is pretty resilient, still there are natural limits on how far they can go if the economic situation continues to deteriorate. Finally, we can see further deterioration of the social situation with more polarization, more fragmentation of the Syrian society, with the regime getting much more brutal than it is right now. So in short, I think that the choice that Syria faces is a choice between soft landing and hard landing. And unfortunately, there are many indicators that the regime in Damascus is moving towards a hard landing, which might become irreversible. Now, on the positive note, I understand that there are a few reasons there are a few foundations for this particular projection, but I think that next year, the year of 2021, might be, under certain circumstances, a turning point in the Syrian conflict and in the domestic political and social evolution of the Syrian regime. After presidential elections of 2021, one could hope that the regime in Damascus might become somewhat more politically mature and might gradually turn to more inclusive and more representative policies. I think that if it happens, if indeed Bashar Assad feels more secure after the presidential elections of next year, we might see gradual, cautious, but still meaningful economic reforms in Syria, and definitely external players like Russia and even Iran will push for economic reforms, for increasing the efficiency of the economic system in Syria. It might also imply a more benign attitude to the problem of detainees and also those refugees which are coming back, not in large numbers, but nevertheless, I think that this is something that the regime can do without jeopardizing the foundations of its own sustainability. I think that gradually we can see some kind of relaxation of relations between Damascus and its neighbors, but also with European countries. In the end of the day, the question of Syria's future largely depends on the ability or inability of major players like the European Union and maybe Gulf states to provide assistance and to lift some of the sanctions that we see in place right now. Again, it's hard to tell whether the United States under this new administration is ready to reconsider the hard approach of the Trump administration, or on the contrary, the Democratic administration, with its emphasis on human rights, will try to push Bashar Assad even harder than the previous administration did. But if we see incremental changes in Damascus, maybe very modest and very small, that might lead to a gradual relaxation of the sanctions regime and restoration of quote-unquote normal economic relations. If it happens, it might trigger new economic but also political developments in the country, which will not resolve all Syrian problems and will not turn Syria into a fully democratic state by 2030, but might gradually change the essence of the regime towards more inclusive and more representative one. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I also started wondering recently whether the Syrian peace, when it does come one day, will be a gradual affair rather than a big ceremony, including a peace deal. Which brings me back to Elham. Elham, earlier you said the Abraham Accords are, of course, a break of a long-standing Arab tradition, Arab League tradition. In fact, one of the I'm not going to say founding moments, but one of the key moments in the history of the Arab League was the Khartoum Declaration, the 3 no's to Israel: no negotiation, no recognition, no peace. Now, of course, the Gulf states were not the first ones. Egypt and Jordan too have peace treaties with Israel, but the substantial mass has now been changed. Do you think that this undermines the Arab League Peace Initiative, which of course has been superseded to some extent? Where do you think the Arab regional system will go from here? Yes, now.
So prior to these announcements, the consensus was outlined most recently in the Arab Peace Initiative led by Saudi Arabia, which basically outlined the requirements for the 22 members of the Arab League to achieve normalization and normal ties with Israel. And those were establishment of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. And I mean, what this does now, I mean, it does effectively undermine that initiative. And I think the real question is going to be whether Saudi Arabia changes its position, because so far that's still formally there. But I think the question will be if Saudi Arabia abandons the Arab Peace Initiative entirely, in which case you're left with very little. Yeah.
So it's all in Riyadh. We all have to wait what changes there. Tariq, earlier when we spoke, we said this might also be an opening for perhaps some painful reforms. I mean, a lot of the traditional sectors of the region have been hit. Tourism, just to name one of them. How do you think they will handle this? These sectors, the decision makers in these sectors, how will they handle this pandemic? Will they perhaps reform into something better? Will they be able to mitigate these effects? Is there something perhaps that we could help to prepare a better future?
Florence, you're setting up the kind of questions that will elicit an answer which unfortunately will not be more positive than I had suggested earlier. I would say most governments in the region, so let's set aside for a moment the small, rich oil exporting countries. Most other countries have committed as many resources as possible to mitigating the impact of the pandemic so far. They were already, to begin with, as we indicated earlier, fiscally very constrained. The region had already been sort of dealing with the ramifications of 4 or 5 years pre-COVID-19 that were slow, and recovery was expected in many ways in 2020. So you enter 2020, you're hit with COVID-19, and you are resource constrained. On paper, based on what we've seen, most countries in the region have committed themselves to essentially the same battery of policy responses that others around the world have done. So some wage subsidies, deferral of taxation, maintaining lending lines or encouraging banks to continue to provide liquidity, even support for small and medium-sized enterprises. On paper, most governments have committed to this and have committed amounts. But quite frankly, and I must underline this very strongly, we don't know how much of what has been committed in terms of policy or resources has made itself felt through the economy. What happened to the implementation here? Who has really benefited? Who seems to be recovering, or at least is feeling the impact of this mitigating measures? Who hasn't? On the other hand, we have a couple of socioeconomic assessments that have been done by, for example, the UNDP in 3 countries that I'm aware of, Tunisia, Jordan, and Lebanon, which raise alarm bells about the immediate economic impact inflicted already on many of the sectors we've mentioned. You know, the tourism, the hospitality, the trade, the construction, retail, spikes in unemployment, higher default rates for small and medium-sized enterprises. And this was before the second surge of the coronavirus pandemic. And so now, as we are entering stage 2, and where countries are fighting very hard to try to avoid massive lockdowns, it's not clear to me that we will be getting more than what we've seen already committed, nor will there be the resources available for them to throw more money at this. This is an opportunity, precisely coming back to your question, to think smartly and to think in a very new way about what you do over the next few years, given that the lingering impact of this crisis, the pandemic/economic crisis, are going to be with us for a few more years to come, maybe for a whole decade. One of the lessons, it seems to me, that has emerged so far, and a reminder for all countries in the region, a reminder to all observers, the importance of having effective, efficient, and capable public sectors. Public sectors governments have rediscovered their legitimacy and relevance in the middle of COVID-19. They were forgotten, they were ignored, they had suffered, I would say, degradation in capabilities and know-how and skills. COVID-19 required that they step up, and they step up quickly, and they step up very innovatively. Yes, in the first phase, it was up to the police and the army because they were the first responders. So that played to the strengths of many countries in the region. But over time, we saw a more robust institutional response coming from central governments. Coordination of policy, integration across departments, things that quite frankly for many, many years were ignored. If you can build on this over the next few years and make public sector reform, public sector management, public sector efficiency, because you need it anyway, you don't have the resources to throw at problems. I think this could be one positive outcome, Florence, moving forward. If you can build on that digitization that you had mentioned earlier, the drive for digitization, mainstreaming it, democratizing it, making it available. And if countries could work with one another. You know, one thing that has been missing in the last few years, and it pains me to say this, but it became glaringly clear in the middle of COVID-19 across the Arab world, there's no spirit of solidarity. No one is helping anyone else. Everyone is left to fend for themselves. If we can do more solidarity in terms of, and show more cooperation, mutually beneficial economic investments in the digitization world, I think we can make a lot of progress. I think looking at taxation and how you diversify your revenue base, again, it's all public sector institutional reforms that can be an important driver, in my humble opinion, for maybe addressing the downside of COVID-19, jumping on the opportunity, and pursuing 10 years where you try to contain the damage and try to sort of deal with the structural issues that will create more poverty, more informality, push more people out of work, make more women not participate in the labor force. And I'm afraid the growth and the income generating cost will be quite high. Last but not least, I think also a renewed effort to re-examine and reimagine cooperation between the Middle East and our neighbors in Europe is in order also. It pains me to hear a lot of talk and to see a lot of policy actions which seem to emphasize maximum pressure on some countries, containing and isolating and marginalizing some countries, sanctioning countries. This region is already in geopolitical disarray and fragmentation, and there is more of this. If you take what Ilham said earlier, that is going to be happening. Is there a possibility, maybe with the opportunity of a new administration in the US, partners like countries and I will name countries here. I'm happy to name countries. I think countries like Germany and Italy can play a leading role in helping to rebalance, reorient, and create the type of energies and cooperation between both sides of the Mediterranean, Europe and the Middle East, that will be good for economic prosperity, good for security, good for migration, and good for many other things. Thank you, Florence.
Thank you, Tariq. We have 4 minutes left, and I would like to seize those to invite you to a daring thought experiment. Which black swan event, you can each one of you name one event over the next 10 years that would make you feel more hopeful about the future. What would that event be? I don't know who would like to go first.
Black swan don't make you more hopeful usually, but let me mention 2. So one which could go wrong and one could increase hope. A war with Iran or by Iran. Iran challenge a new government next June, hardliner, deep economic crisis, nothing to lose in starting some external adventure. And the hope, the white swan, Saudi Arabia joins the peace agreement with Israel, and the new government in Israel, happy for this, recognize the two-state solution, and we go into some kind of new pattern.
Thank you, Paulo. It feels good just to hear these things, even if hope seems a bit dim at the moment. Elham, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in at the risk of these sounding like hot takes. So the first scenario is when the UAE first entered into the Accords. Its initial promises was that it had gotten Israel to commit not to go ahead with annexation. So the possible scenario there is that it does use its new relationship to push ahead with a solution for the Palestinians and annexation. The de facto annexation and forge ahead with a two-state solution somehow and build consensus around what needs to be done there. The second very positive scenario is if Biden does go back to the JCPOA, and at the same time, there's a second track involving the 2 Gulf states, leading to a resolution to the conflict in Yemen, consensus around issues in Iraq and Iran's role more broadly, consensus on ballistic missiles, and then you have this miraculous Gulf-Iran rapprochement, which leads to again a better regional situation, and maybe not so much the need for Israel to bridge, or Saudi to bridge ties with Israel. Those are 2 possible scenarios which seem very, very optimistic. Yeah.
Thank you. As I said, it feels nice to just hear those. Andre, what's your black swan?
Well, let me also give you 2.
Go ahead.
The bad one is an implosion of a major country in the region. Egypt failing to meet the challenge of economic and social development, and the problem will be definitely further complicated by the demographic change in the country and the climate change and many other developments. And second, potential failed revolution in Saudi Arabia. This is either or. In terms of the positive scenario, I would offer what I would call a gender revolution in the region, something that would lead to empowering women, and that would be a game changer for major economic and social developments in the region. I think very positive.
Thank you. Last but not least, Tariq.
I just want to add my voice to all the, the hopeful and the not so hopeful black swans that all my colleagues have suggested. I would maybe the only black swan I would add, and it will be one, and the implications and the impact of it could both be positive and negative. Maybe negative in the immediate term, but more positive over time. I think we could see a return of protests in the region over the next few years. Protests that are not driven by calls for political reform. They're not driven by corruption or against abuses of power and crony capitalists in the way we saw in 2011. I think the protests of the coming few years, should some of the scenarios I outlined transpire, will be driven by people who want to eat, will be driven by hunger and deprivation and destitute in many countries in the region. In Yemen and in maybe Syria, but also in some of the other low-income countries where I think the impact of COVID-19, the economic crisis, and all the dislocation will push more and more people into poverty. And I would say we should anticipate a black swan event of that sort over the next few years.
Thank you. Thank you, Paulo. Thank you, Elham, Tariq, Andre, for this little journey to the future. I really hope we can record this session and compare in 2030 what we thought was perhaps going to happen or what the outlooks were, because you gave us a few milestones or signposts that people should look out for to get a better feeling for where things are going. The future is, of course, not just trends, it's also events. So the things that you just mentioned might very well happen. And perhaps in the future we'll say, I hope so, that we were too pessimistic. So thanks to all of you, and see you soon, I hope, in person.
And to you, Florence, you have been great.
Thank you, Paulo.
Thank you, Florence.
Thank you.
Ciao, ciao. See you soon.
Yeah.